When I was first assigned Goldman Sachs for this project, I was really only familiar with the name. I knew they had something to do with money, but that was about all I knew. I'm not a finance guy, and this project really challenged me to open up my box of comfort here and expand upon my thoughts and consideration over the big picture and what's necessary to meet the challenges ahead in the 21st century. Finance is a critical element because we will invest in the future. So it's crucial to invest in sustainability to avoid a certain kind of path dependency that locks us into a trajectory that challenges our goals and wishes for a prosperous future. I spent hours clicking through the many SEC filings on Goldman Sachs, their latest annual report for 2014, but I could not understand what I was looking at. Not to say that it wasn't complex, but I was not able to understand how the world can be quantified in such ways that illuminate those with capital and distort and make invisible those without capital. It's a system of partitioning, and making markets in green investment is continuance down the same direction away from Commons' approach. I recall the first time I Googled the name Goldman Sachs. Right at top of the list was conspiracy theory sites dedicated to talking about global finance and Goldman Sachs. Great! Who doesn't love a good conspiracy? As I began to dig into the powerful Wall Street investment firm, it all started coming back to me. Oh, Goldman Sachs, the ones who drove up the housing bubble with that mortgage-backed lending scheme and profited off destroying thousands of hometown communities around the country, only to have taxpayers bail them out while CEOs jumped out of the scene with golden parachutes attached. The firm has earned its reputation as a vampire squid sucking blood out of everything that smells like money and funneling it upwards to those who own the capital, the shareholders of Goldman. Goldman has a fiduciary responsibility, bound by law to maximize its profits. So is it really surprising then that when short-term thinking is incentivized by stratospheric payouts, ruthlessness would eventually ensue? Besides, Goldman is only delivering what it is their shareholders want: money. So when the goose is golden, nobody will shoot it, even after the public image crisis Goldman Sachs faced during the Troubled Asset Relief Program of 2008 and the fallout around its role in profiting off the financial collapse it caused. Goldman was charged by the SEC for conflict of interest when Goldman recommended to their clients risky mortgage-backed securities that they knew would default and fail. Goldman then betted against their clients in the market to isolate and insulate themselves from the collapse of the mortgage bubble, profiting against the investments they recommended to their own clients. The charges were dropped when Goldman agreed to pay a historic $550 million fine, admitting to a mistake. This is a far cry from the trillions in damages the fallout of this financial disaster has created from irresponsible, predatory lending. Today, the new pillar for sustainable finance is to root out all predatory finance. Hard to accomplish in a world global capitalist economy that must grow or die. Give them what they want, and they'll keep on coming back for more. Nobody's going to mess with a goose that golden, and Goldman Sachs is the goldenness of them all. What we as society decide to spend our money on is a reflection of our values. And right now, those values are surrounded around short-term financial wealth generation, making money by using markets as a casino, investors betting against investors, against the future, and pocketing returns when trouble brews. Currently, the world financial markets are in an absolute crisis. We humans have a tendency to over-maximize complex systems. This is like having a really busy schedule and no time to fit in an unexpected appointment. It leaves little room for flexibility when change is unexpected and surprise arises. To keep the financial game afloat and producing what people want, that is, what the people with capital to invest, the capital owners want, money, Goldman has been leading the charge to fluff stock prices with stock buybacks. This leaves an illusion that the markets are healthy, like inflating a giant bubble. Again, only this time the scale will not be regional, it will be global. And when an over-maximized system collapses, prior studies of financial collapse tell us it's when capital is inequitable. And today, that's the reality we face more than ever before in human history. Inequality between current and future generations are the highest ever in human history. There is a fall coming. The carbon bubble will be the final blow to this brittle regime, and many will lose a seat once the music stops and the party's over. The pressures that our lifestyles in the West place on Earth systems is like overdrawing from an account each year. It can be done for a while, chipping away at the base year after year, but eventually Mother Nature hands us an invoice, and we must pay up. The scale is global for the first time. We are now a big world on a small planet, and that's why geologists are renaming the current geologic epoch to the Anthropocene. Anthro, for us humans, 7 billion and growing multiplied by our industrial metabolism, and Pocene for age. This term is meant to serve as a reminder of the awesome responsibility it is to hold this position, serving as a warning to remain mindful and precautionary of such a responsibility. Having the ability to understand the consequences of our actions in such detail compels us to act swiftly. This is unprecedented in all of history. We are the first generation to have all of this data, the first generation capable of ending global poverty, but also the last generation able to take meaningful action to limit dangerous interference in Earth's climate. We must act because it's the moral thing to do. We will be judged by those in the future. What legacy do you want to leave behind? We cannot escape or hide or outrun what we face ahead. Suffering is going to be a normal part of reconnecting with the right relationship with Earth. But it is not a dark blanket on growth. We will grow and find ways to reimagine living in a new age of humans. Why should Goldman Sachs care so much about climate change? Climate change threatens to undo all of the progress we have enjoyed, especially efforts to alleviate poor people from burdens of hunger and disease. Cultural yields in Africa could fall by as much as 30%. More than 1 billion people could be affected by rising sea levels, mainly poor people, in the cities of the developing world. Hundreds of millions of people will be threatened by extreme weather events, by typhoons and hurricanes. And so we absolutely must address climate change as an urgent problem. Because if we don't, it will only hurt people. It will also radically harm our economies. And as much as 40% of the Earth's biodiversity could be lost. Climate change will undermine our productivity in very drastic ways. Last year, Goldman Sachs spent more on stock buybacks than it earned, and it borrowed to buy even more. The stocks are bloated to the highest levels in history as a result. And when the system falls, guess who will hold the cards? Goldman Sachs. But what if Goldman uses its power in Washington, its influence over regulators and trusting clients as the golden goose, to redirect its investments towards sustainability for a better world? As wealth owners begin to demand divestment in fossil fuel industries, the International Energy Agency is warning that $26 trillion in stranded carbon assets will be unleashed upon the global market over the coming decade ahead. There is an expectation that fossil fuel reserves will eventually be liquidated, Yet experts agree that burning any more than 1/4 of those reserves will kill all life on the planet, which will prevent us from ever getting close to using all of those reserves. That's a powerful blow, but also a powerful opportunity to invest in the things that can help add resiliency to the global economy so that more people can enjoy a good life. And institutions promote long-term multidimensional wealth creation to benefit all people. If institutions fail, coupled with climate changes, coupled with resource depletion, coupled with inequality, this could lead to crisis. The war now going on in Syria is a perfect example.
One of the most horrific conflicts on the whole planet now is in Syria. Syria is part of the Mediterranean environment, which the climate models tell us is already a drying region that is likely to get much drier in the future. This is by virtue of the Mediterranean location in the world climate system. All through the Mediterranean basin, there has been a drop of rainfall over the last 20 years. But in Syria, there was nearly 10 years of continuous drought. Over time, 1 year of drought may be manageable, 2 years of drought, hard to get a crop, but by 3 years of drought, the soils lack all moisture and the crops start to fail. Populations start to move, farm families can't survive, and people abandon their homesteads. In very complex, not well-governed places, when people move, frictions explode, frustrations, hunger, and of course, desperation also take off. And now we've got major drought, major population movements, and major food insecurity. Nothing much was done because the world doesn't respond to these kinds of warnings. Nor did the Syrian government, an authoritarian government capable of great brutality, already overburdened itself from the chronic decade-long drought. What was the consequence? Drought wasn't the cause of Syria's conflict, but one can say that drought and food scarcity, soaring food prices, hungry people, and displaced populations all combined to form a nemesis situation, a complex mix of bad governance, frustration, and corruption. In 2011, when the so-called Arab Spring erupted in Tunisia and Egypt, protesters began massively in Syria. The Assad regime cracked down on those protesters. Military insurgents broke away from the Syrian army, and suddenly there was support coming from the outside powers, the United States, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, supporting the insurgency. There was Russia and Iran supporting the Assad regime, and quickly brewing up a perfect storm brought on by drought, famine, and food insecurity. Violence erupts, violence into war, war into proxy war, and soon more than 160,000 people dead. Disaster. And still, a completely unresolved and indeed spreading war. This is important to understand because it demonstrates how climate change acts as a threat multiplier to social, ecological subsystems already overburdened with the challenges of migration, healthcare, education, corruption, and rule of law. We should understand our human capacity and that we have it to adjust sometimes. Sometimes we're able to counteract these kinds of events. Sometimes we're able to use our intelligence and our smarts to get ahead of the curve. And sometimes we are just dumber than dumb. The visceral emotions, the hate, the fear, the arms take over, and what begins as an ecological crisis turns into a full-fledged human disaster. War and growing threat of ever-widening proportions. The point is, climate change is going to have massive impacts on the planet. And we have to learn to think ahead and think cooperatively if this is not going to get the best of us. Today's institutions are designed for an era we have left behind. And we must begin thinking about how to create institutions while living in the Anthropocene, the age of human management over Earth systems. How can we use our intelligence, our technology, our know-how, and the global tools of cooperation to get ahead of the curve? Are we able to find the path forward and help to illuminate those ways so that we don't end up in this kind of disaster, but rather find a way to cooperation, to peace, and to security for everybody?
The example with Syria's war is a parable for our times. We think we are insulated from the world, but the world is now one. What happens in one region has many teleconnections with the rest of the interconnected world, and when the whole system is over-maximized, a blow to the gut might just leave us no longer standing. These are the types of inconvenient feedbacks we face in the Anthropocene era. Goldman Sachs has been working in divergent countries to help build the base necessary for advancing modern economic development into remote areas for the first time, focusing on basic services and infrastructure investment. And that requires access to affordable, clean, and democratic energy and the financial capital to get projects started. Goldman's impacts is to drive global progress based on economic prosperity and access to markets and capital. In Latin America, Goldman has provided capital for launching a biofuel company, now producing sustainable bio-oils that will provide the region with long-term stable economic opportunities for many years ahead. In Australia, they've been promoting greater diversity in the workplace and supporting one of the country's largest green energy retailers through innovative corporate financing. In India, Goldman Sachs helps women go to college to earn degrees in finance and is investing in wind projects there. And they are targeting Indian women entrepreneurs to help them advance their innovations. And they've helped Nova invest in 12 specialty surgery centers that provide expert surgical care to regions in India with no access. In Hong Kong, Goldman is working with boards to help get more representation by women in corporate governance. They're involved with the LGBT business community and recently hosted a global macroeconomic outlook seminar that attracted 2,000 clients to discuss pressing issues. In Israel, Goldman is working with a leading food bank and helping to connect Chinese and Israeli business communities. In London, Goldman has launched a 10,000 small businesses initiative, similar to the one here that they started in the US, providing small businesses with capital to progress and expand their reach into new markets. All kinds of good, all kinds of efforts to green the world economy. These are the minimum standards to be held to according to the ISO Social Responsibility Framework. Social responsibility is needed to safeguard our future. A sustainable world depends upon what we do about human rights, the environment, and ethical behavior through organizational governance and fair operating practices. ISO 26000 framework helps turn great ideas into effective actions. But the entire globe will need to sing together in chorus to meet the challenges straight on. The framework helps organizations find the stepping stones to implementing broad-scoped goals into ideas on the street and in our homes. We need better governance because we have technical know-how. We just fail within the social sphere and institutions to distribute benefits justly. But if Goldman is at the same time profiting off of unsustainable systems, then how much good will it take to outweigh all of the bad? And what if the bad leads to us preventing to stay within Earth's boundaries?
The ambivalence we are surrounded with is astonishing. People tend to distance themselves from the truth. The bigger picture shows basic fundamental realities that helps keep a clear picture of what's going on in keeping us divided. People are confused and must look at the bigger picture of Earth system change. Carbon dioxide emissions are not the only driver that our human enterprise places as a stressor on Earth systems. Conflict is business as usual for gaining the resources the West needs to keep its desire to live unsustainably. And it leaves everybody else in the world to deal with the consequences first. It's a complex equation we face, not a this or that dichotomous one. People and nature are intertwined, and humans are really an embedded part of the planet, shaping the planet now from local to global scales. It's especially the global scale that has been a fairly recent achievement that catalyzed the idea that the human enterprise is now in the Anthropocene era. At the same time, as we are shaping the planet, we are also fundamentally dependent on the capacity of this little round ball that we're living on to supply us with the basics of food, water, and a lot of ecosystem services, like recycling of basic nutrients and mineral salts that our body needs, or other types of services, like regulating the climate in the world of the Anthropocene. With not only rising human pressures on the planet, but also an increasingly interconnected world in terms of social, financial, and economic exchange across all nations in the world, we must recognize that we are entering a realm where interconnectedness translates into what we call teleconnections. Teleconnections are when changes in one part of the world cascades itself to impacts in other parts of the world. And these kinds of teleconnections must be understood because they can themselves trigger surprise and what we call inconvenient feedbacks that can implicate the possibilities for sustainable development. This is different compared to the way we've perceived development in the past, where we've tried to map out resources, tried to predict and assume that things change linearly and incrementally. That's on the basis upon which we built our entire economy, assuming that we can predict change in the environment.
Values underpin sustainable development, and one kind of value approach is the human rights approach. The idea is that every human being on the planet within any political system has human rights, and human rights of 5 sorts: civil rights as citizens, political rights to participate in governance, economic rights that define the right of individuals to meet basic needs, social rights, the right to live in secure families and communities, and cultural rights, the right to participate in one's culture. And that human rights approach, while not universally subscribed to by each person on the planet, has been found compelling across the world by individuals, by activists, by many different kinds of groups, by most governments. And it has become enshrined in a very important way in international law and in the norms of the international political and diplomatic system under the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. Article 22 calls for the right to social security. In other words, to a guaranteed base so that human dignity and the most basic needs of water, shelter, clothing, and so forth can be met. Article 23 of the Universal Declaration calls for the right to work, to a livelihood, to be able for individuals to support themselves and their families. Article 24 calls for the right to rest and leisure, so that one can't demand work of around the clock and in burdensome and crushing ways. Article 25 says that there is universal right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of the individual himself and of his family, including food, clothing, housing, and medical care and necessary social services, and the right to security in the event of unemployment, sickness, disability, widowhood, old age, or other lack of livelihood in circumstances beyond his control. Motherhood and childhood are entitled to special care and assistance. What a remarkable, bold statement. How unmet that remains today. We now know with more than 1 billion people still living in extreme poverty. To reach social responsibility, we need to get the order right. First, cease to do evil, then learn to do good. As long as Euro-America needs 80% of the rest of the world's resources, we are going to end up having to go next door and bully people to get it. It seems to me that if our way of life is causing most of the problems that the rest of the world has to deal with, the best thing we can do is deal with our own way of life. This is not rocket science. It is the Euro-American way of life that needs to be put under the microscope. The first step is to examine and change our own behavior, including examining the unusualness of a society embedded in an economy. Culture cannot be taught with a piece of chalk. We need to address our own deficiencies, not rush off to fix somebody else's. Development interventions are typically conceived as some type of addition, which is based on the premise that underdevelopment is caused by some type of absence. The problem with this approach is that it shifts attention away from the international community's own role as resource degrader and focuses instead only on its potential role as helper. Goldman needs to ask not just what it can do to help, but also what it must do to stop hurting. And that requires accepting our real position where economies of scale, set to the limits of natural regeneration, are embedded within society, embedded within the natural biosphere we share this planet with.
Countries like to claim that they can't afford to fight climate change, saying they would love to address climate change, but cannot afford to. We're going to have to wait until we have more resources to act. This is a really foolish thing to say. The evidence is very clear that while it does cost some money, it costs a lot more not to act. We should think about acting on climate change not as a cost, but as an example. For example, investing in energy efficiency. It's not free, but it pays back for itself. Investing in energy efficient cities, more compact cities, investing in public transportation. It costs money, but it pays back incredibly quickly, not only in terms of the environment, but also in terms of the economy. There's co-benefits along with climate change action, like improved health, lower traffic congestion, and happier employees who can get to work under less stressful conditions.
Who's responsible for overuse of resources and unsustainable development? Each region, each country is being examined and analyzed. This helps advanced, developed economies see what needs to be adjusted to bring action back within to the safe and just space for humanity. They can then backcast their ways to develop pathways for deep decarbonization of the global economy. Assessing the environmental ceiling and the social foundations helps operationalize for policymakers and investors where each area needs to improve to reach the best collective approach for our human enterprise. Then we can add up all of the countries to get a global picture of how well we are doing to remain within planetary limits, where adjustments need focusing, to rein in our current transgressions and walk towards regeneration, where billions more can enjoy in the good life and access development.
As the example of Syria's war so aptly foretells, today we are in a situation where surprise is a core element of change, coupled together with an element of complexity. Not only is climate, ecosystems, health, and development interacting with each other in a hyper-connected world, not only do we have teleconnections, but what can occur when a series of global drivers cause an impact which is totally unexpected, often in a very different part of the world than the very source of the problems. We call them inconvenient feedbacks. They are big, major, surprising events that occur based on global drivers translating themselves to unexpected outcomes. These examples of social hyperconnectivity are increasingly well understood. They must be layered together with the recognition that we have exactly the same rising hyperconnectivity, even interdependence, given the teleconnections we see when it comes to changes in the environmental system. Put together, there's a recognition that we live in a much more complicated, hyper-connected world where changes in the climate system affects ecosystems, which together influences both human health, economics, and development at large. This is the new reality Goldman is facing. Economies embedded in societies must be aligned with natural systems, and Goldman needs to learn to think and manage in patterns so that our economies are in the right relationship with natural systems. Simply disaggregating climate risks, securitizing and reselling them through innovative climate solutions like green bonds and yield vehicles, Goldman is simply rebundling the issue to increase total return to shareholders today on the lost opportunity of establishing a more regenerative total return to all stakeholders. Goldman needs standards of accounting for multi-levels of wealth. A focus on optimizing for financial capital alone is not in alignment with the right relationship, nor is optimizing for shareholders alone. Goldman must move towards an investment framework which optimizes for stakeholders. That requires adaptive management, not command and control. It requires alternative forms of ownership and collaboration and new theory to see and measure it. There are universal patterns that govern complex systems around the world. Economies embedded in social systems must be aligned with natural systems, and this requires that managers learn to see and think in patterns. It is unethical for one generation to overuse their share of benefits and leave the future with no opportunity to enjoy those same benefits. The assumption that GDP growth is how we prosper is false. At Goldman, all efforts are to seek opportunities to create large returns to shareholders through means of finding ways to address large-scale societal needs. Focusing on financial capital ignores the multiple dimensions of value received through all forms of social capital, natural capital, and non-use value. The belief that value is money is wrong, and has resulted in this current interconnected crisis of crisis du jour we face. Profit-focused investment fails to account for the many social benefits received by redirecting investment towards a systemic answer to addressing complex change. This requires institutional changes that are more adapted to living and thinking about what it means to be in the Anthropocene.
Sustainable development targets three broad goals for society: economic growth that's within reach for all parts of the world, even those few places that have been stuck in poverty until the early 21st century. The second broad goal is to respect the planetary boundaries, that is, to combine economic growth and the choice of technologies and behaviors and policies so that we don't trespass the Earth's boundaries and create a terrible environmental crisis of climate change or acidity of the oceans or loss of biodiversity. The third main goal of sustainable development is social inclusion. The idea that an economy should serve all of its people, that the benefits of economic growth should be widely shared, that everybody should have a chance at prosperity, at proper healthcare, education, and we know that that challenge is also an unfulfilled challenge in many parts of the world. Throughout history, many of the gains of an economy have been concentrated at the top. And throughout most of history, the gains of an economy have been highly concentrated in one half of humanity, the men, with women facing discrimination and an inability to participate equally and productively in society. Social inclusion, therefore, is like the challenge of ending poverty and the challenge of environmental sustainability. An unfinished goal, but one that is within reach. The Earth is subsidizing our global economy. We need investment in regeneration. Today's current progress ignores the invisibility of non use value and natural capital. It's a destructive process as a result. Fixing markets, regulators can redefine the roles of business by defining the boundaries investment operates within, then allowing markets to work their magic. Peter Baker, president of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, declared recently that CSR is dead. To survive in a world of rising competition for finite and dwindling resources, Baker explained, of increasingly volatile and uncertain fossil fuel prices, of potentially destabilizing feedbacks from Earth for entire societies, we can no longer consider the planet as an external issue for business. Instead, the planet is the business of business. Wise management of ecosystems gives economic benefits. There are ample examples today showing that when we value, even at a conservative level, the role played by ecosystems in our economic activities, then sustainable practices and businesses are more profitable than unsustainable ones. Furthermore, sustainable management of ecosystems helps to build resilience, which is an insurance capital in the face of various shocks. The estimates are adopted from the 2005 UN First Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, the Natural Capital Project, and the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity, otherwise known as TEEB, initiative. The numbers are clear. Avoiding destruction in exchange for regeneration is a wise economic strategy. Each hectare that's preserved avoids added costs and adds additional value.
We need institutions that will embrace change and collaborate around common problems and visions of the future we wish for our children and their children. For over 500 years, humans have been busy finding ways to optimize systems, to the point where over-optimization has gotten us into trouble, leaving us brittle and vulnerable to blows from climate changes. Regenerative capitalism is holistic and a threat to business as usual. But anything less of response is not being realistic and cognizant of the magnitude of order of change that social ecological subsystems face as climate change and resource depletion escalate. This requires an integrative approach to economics and finance that seeks new theory to see it and new measures to track it. Relying on total returns to stakeholders as a sole indicator of progress is flawed and ignores the complexity of interconnectivity, change, and inconvenient feedback. Dividends do not create value, so measures need to be broken down into subcomponents. A regenerative economy interplays with universal patterns that governs complex systems around the planet. It seeks to restore lost connections with ignored and underrepresented components of the whole big picture that has historically been viewed valueless. In the year 2015, the world will adopt a new set of goals for sustainable development. How will projected changes in the world's population affect our ability to achieve these new goals? Cities will absorb all of the world's population growth over the next 15 years. This puts them on the front line of eliminating poverty, reducing pollution, and ensuring safe access to water and essential services. Currently, there are more than 230 million international migrants in the world. Over the next 15 years, the number could increase by more than 30 million people. International migration can be a transformative focus for both migrants and their communities. In order to harness the full potential of migration for development, however, we must create safe and legal channels for safe and orderly migration. Our greatest challenge for the future is to ensure that our world's population can thrive. We must eliminate both poverty and unsustainable patterns. of both production and consumption. Through a deeper understanding of how the world is changing, combined with better planning, stronger partnerships, and greater political will, Goldman Sachs can create a better tomorrow for both people and planet.
The takeaway message is that society, business, and governments need to march lockstep together, hand in hand, towards sustainable development to ensure that investment is directed towards the paths that will lead to the future we all vision. The old arguments over who should move first, governments or business, has fallen out of fashion, and we now know that both must move in unison. To make this a reality, to really drive these ideas, we need a new system for accounting for our value in society. Goldman Sachs should begin analyzing its investments based on the reconnecting, holistic, regenerative approach. They have been working with the Woods Hole Research Center to innovate new ways to account for ecosystem services, helping provide the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity framework, the exposure to make meaningful impacts in true costing, value creation, and measuring benefits with invisible parts of the economy. The UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network published their third annual World Happiness Report last week. Maybe in the near future, measures of happiness and ecosystem regeneration will have more value than measures of financial wealth and destructive behavior. The 2005 Ecosystems Assessment estimates that ecosystem services account for all total global annual GDP. So the size of our financial capacities is matched with the size of the Earth's productivity. It's true across the entire economic spectrum. In rural areas, for example, there are 2 billion hectares today, twice the size of China, that are now degraded lands. They used to be forest, they're not useful for agriculture, so they seem to have no value. Yet if we could regreen just 150 million of those, that would bring $100 billion every year to poor people, and it would lower the carbon gap by almost 1/5. We should think of this as an investment in the future. If we don't act on climate change, our entire economic system is threatened. We live in a historic time, a 1 in 500 year paradigm shift. We need a collective epiphany and seek out a new story, one that aligns our humanistic values with the new science of holistic understanding and away from reductionist problem solving. Catalyzing the change to what's emerging will take some carrots and sticks and maybe a few clubs to plan for a regenerative economy that restores frayed human systems and allows room for natural systems to restore themselves.